This content is AI generated for informational purposes only and should not be directly used for clinical decision-making.
Hello and welcome back to the Neurosurgery Hub podcast. I'm Dr. Ayers, a senior attending in neurosurgery.
And I'm Dr. Alara, a research fellow. Today we're looking at a fascinating new study from 2026, published in Epileptic Disorders, titled Beyond Broca and Wernicke, Epilepsy Surgery in the Language Areas.
It's a timely piece, Alara. For decades, we've taught residents that language is essentially two boxes connected by a wire, Broca's and Wernicke's areas. But this paper really emphasizes how that classical model is being replaced by a much more complex, distributed, and dynamically interconnected system.
Exactly. The authors argue that as our understanding of these networks grows, our surgical planning must evolve. They start by stressing the importance of the preoperative neuropsychological assessment. It isn't just about getting a baseline, it's about identifying the functional deficit zone and how it relates to the epileptogenic zone, or EZ.
Right, and that assessment is the foundation for everything else. If we don't know the patient's baseline linguistic subdomains, like naming, fluency, or comprehension, we can't accurately measure the impact of our intervention. But moving beyond the bedside exam, let's talk about the imaging. The paper discusses the transition from the invasive WADA test to functional MRI.
That's a key point. Bold fMRI is now a standard non-invasive tool for lateralization. However, the paper highlights a challenge we see often, especially in pediatric cases or with patients who have cognitive impairments. Task-based fMRI can be unreliable if the patient can't perform the task correctly.
Which is where resting state MRI, or RSMRI, comes in.
Precisely. Because it's task-free, it allows us to map language networks even in uncooperative patients. The paper suggests that RSMRI and Bold fMRI are complementary tools that are becoming indispensable in the pre-surgical workup.
Now, let's get into the bread and butter of epilepsy surgery planning, stereoelectroencephalogram, or SEEG, and mapping. The study describes SEEG as pivotal. When we are placing these depth electrodes, we aren't just looking for where the seizures start, we're mapping the eloquent cortex.
One of the most interesting sections for me was the discussion on electrical stimulation, or ES. We traditionally use high-frequency stimulation to map function, but the authors discuss the use of different frequencies. Specifically, they mention that intermediate frequency stimulations can be just as effective as high-frequency ones, but carry a lower risk of inducing post-discharges.
That's a critical safety point for the residents listening. If you're stimulating a language area and you trigger a post-discharge, you might get a false positive for a functional deficit, or worse, a seizure. Using a battery of tests that target different language subdomains while minimizing those discharges is the optimal approach the paper recommends.
They also dive into what happens in the OR. While awake craniotomy remains a gold standard for real-time monitoring in cooperative patients, the paper mentions a task-free alternative for when the patient is under general anesthesia, corticocortical evoked potentials.
I'm glad they included that. It uses the connectivity of the brain to map pathways without needing the patient to speak. It's part of that shift toward an integrated multimodal approach the authors are advocating for.
When it comes to the actual surgery, the options have expanded. We still do focal resections and lobectomies, but the paper highlights minimally invasive techniques like stereo EEG-guided radiofrequency thermocoagulation, RFTC, and laser interstitial thermal therapy, or LIT.
LIT is particularly interesting in these language areas because it allows us to be so precise. The choice between a traditional resection and these thermal techniques really depends on the accessibility and the extent of the epileptogenic zone.
To wrap up, the paper looks toward the future. They mention the role of machine learning in analyzing these massive data sets we're collecting, postoperative outcomes, imaging, and physiology, to better predict which patients will achieve seizure freedom without losing language function.
It really comes down to the fact that we can't just look at a map and say, don't touch this spot. We have to understand the individual network of that specific patient.
It's a great read for anyone looking to modernize their approach to language area surgery.
Absolutely. Well, that's all the time we have for this segment. Alara, would you like to summarize the next major section of the paper, perhaps focusing on the specific clinical outcomes and case studies mentioned?